What initially piqued your interest in this topic, a perhaps lesser-known component of U.S. Cold War foreign policy?
Like most really interesting subjects for research, I kind of ran across this by serendipity. I was doing something else. I was researching U.S.-South Vietnamese relations, which was the subject of my first two books. And I had always accepted the standard explanation for why, ultimately, John F. Kennedy opted to settle for a neutralized government in Laos and draw the line against communist expansion in Southeast Asia in South Vietnam. The standard explanation was it's because Laos presented what one historian calls a logistical nightmare, and it does present a logistical nightmare. It presented a logistical nightmare back then with these, first of all, it's landlocked. There are these tall, sawtooth mountains. There are these narrow valleys. There's no road network that's usable throughout the entire year. There are only 2 airstrips, and those are only usable in a couple of months every year. So it made sense to me that obviously Kennedy would have chosen to draw the line in South Vietnam because South Vietnam has a coastline. South Vietnam has a more modern road system. The logistical explanation seemed plausible to me, and I never thought to question it before. So while I was researching another topic, U.S.-South Vietnamese relations, I kept running across members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, members of the Defense Department, members of the State Department, other Kennedy advisors, and also going back to the Eisenhower era, advisors for President Eisenhower as well, saying, when they spoke about Laos, that they didn't stress logistical problems. In fact, they pointed out that Laos has a number of logistical advantages over South Vietnam. That, indeed, for someone like Curtis LeMay or other air power advocates, Laos is actually preferable to South Vietnam because all of the fighting by 1959 and 1960 between our American-backed forces and the Pathet Lao, the communists, and the neutralists under Cong Lê is taking place in the Plain of Jars, which, according to one Air Force specialist, said that this is like a giant-sized golf course. It's perfect. It's dead solid perfect for our bombers. So that is one advantage that Laos had logistically over South Vietnam. There's no area in South Vietnam where bombers would have had this kind of unobstructed access. And also, something I never thought of before, but it's so self-evident once you start thinking about it, is that Laos has a 1,000-mile border with a very pro-U.S. country at the time in Thailand. And the Thai premier, Sari Thanarat, was more than willing to allow the United States to use his country as a base from which to attack the Pathet Lao. And Sari Thanarat was also more than supportive of our strongman in Laos, General Phumi Nasavan, because Phumi Nasavan happened to be his cousin. And so the more I read about this, the more I learned looking through the archives, it seemed to me that the logistical argument didn't make any sense, and that actually if logistics were what was driving Dwight Eisenhower's policy, John F. Kennedy's policy, we would have chosen to fight in Laos, not South Vietnam. So why didn't we? And I explored this issue because it interested me, and the more I read, the more I canvassed declassified documents and a host of archives, I learned it had nothing to do with logistics. It had to do with this. I know racist is the most loaded word out there, but there really is no other term that will suffice here. This poisonous bigotry that American policymakers expressed over and over and over again about the Lao. That while they held all inhabitants of Southeast Asia, all Asians, period, in a degree of disdain, they reserved a special scorn and hauteur for the Lao. The Lao, according to the American ideological construction, possessed every quality that you don't want in an ally. They're lazy, they're stupid, they're childish, they're fickle. Literally every negative descriptor you can imagine in the popular American conception is attached to the Lao, and they lack everything that we want in an ally. Courage, steadfastness, intelligence, maturity. And these were qualities that Americans did ascribe to the Vietnamese. Now, don't get me wrong, they held the Vietnamese in a degree of disdain, but they held them on a high, in the pecking order of America's imagined Asia, the Vietnamese ranked much higher. You constantly see references not only in governmental documents, but also in the popular media, in terms of scholarly publications, people like Virginia Johnson with this standard reference book, French Indochina, she mentioned several times how the Vietnamese, or Annamites as she called them at the time, are much more mature, much more industrious, much more dependable than the Lao, who she describes as lazy, insouciant. And so the more I looked into this, what seemed to be the case when I first started digging, the more I dug, the more clear it became that this is not about logistics, it's about ethnocentrism, it's about racism, it's about popular cultural perceptions, which a lot of people have trouble acknowledging are often what drive policy. It's not always something as concrete as logistics or economic advantage. You have to make room for these kind of mushy categories of analysis: racism, religious intensity, or a variety of motivations that are not easy to measure on a map or in a bank book, but that do play an enormous role in how policymakers conduct themselves and their nation in the global arena.
You begin your book by describing the conversation between Eisenhower and Kennedy on the eve of Kennedy's inauguration. Their attention at that meeting was almost entirely focused on Laos. Why was Laos of such vital importance to U.S. interests in 1961?
Well, because in late January 1961, when Dwight Eisenhower vacated the White House and turned over the presidency to John F. Kennedy, and this was a major watershed. You have, at that time, the oldest president in history. I know Reagan was older, but at the time, Eisenhower was the oldest president who'd ever served in America, turning over the presidency to the youngest elected president in John F. Kennedy. Teddy Roosevelt was younger when he became president, but that was because of an assassination. So there's a huge generational change. Obviously, there's a colossal gulf in experience. Kennedy, whatever problems he might have had with Dwight Eisenhower in other areas, trusted his military judgment. How could you not trust Dwight Eisenhower's military judgment? It's the architect of victory in Europe in World War II. And Eisenhower said, if you read the minutes of this meeting, and not only the official minutes, but also the notes kept by 5 or 6 different people, it's all about Laos. Eisenhower said this is the most important, this is the cork in the bottle in Asia. This is where we have to focus all of our attention. This is the most pressing problem facing us now. And the reason he said that, I think, is because if you look at the other Cold War flashpoints as of January 1961, which is when he surrenders the presidency. I said 1960 before, January 1961. At that point, Cuba is lost, obviously. Fidel Castro has come to power in Cuba. There's nothing we can do about that now. Eisenhower does have some plans in the works that ultimately blew up in everybody's face with the Bay of Pigs, but that's in the future. South Vietnam seems relatively stable as of January 1961. South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem survived a coup attempt in 1960. He seemed to have the situation under control. While the situation there was serious, it was not dire. The situation in Berlin, which had been a real flashpoint for a long time, seemed to have been at least temporarily resolved, as did the situation in the Congo and these various other Cold War hotspots. But the one place where things really seemed as though they were going to go south for the United States, and soon, was Laos. As of January 1961, the Pathet Lao and the Neutralists had joined together. They were fighting against our boy, Phumi Nosavan, General Phumi Nosavan. It looked certain that they were going to defeat him. And people like Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense designate, was absolutely certain that we were going to have to send at least 200,000 American troops to Laos. And Eisenhower did nothing to dampen or mollify that attitude. It's a very alarmist stance that Washington is taking toward Laos at this point. So it's not as though there weren't other things on the president's plate. But as of January 1961, the one issue that really preoccupied the outgoing president and the soon-to-be inaugurated president was Laos. And this strikes students nowadays. When you mention this in lecture, they always laugh. Because we know now, in retrospect, that Vietnam wound up being where the United States chose to make its stand against communism in Southeast Asia. But that was not how matters stood as of January 1961.
What were the Chinese and Soviet perceptions of the strategic importance of Laos? Did they invest equally to the initial U.S. investment? And if not, then why did the military and political efforts not quickly sway to the U.S. advantage?
Well, that's really two questions. Let me address the first one first. No, the Soviet Union and the Communist Chinese did not invest in Laos at even remotely the same degree that the United States did. In fact, and again, here I have to rely on secondary sources because I'll confess I do not speak or read Russian and I do not speak or read Chinese, so I was not able to exploit archives in Moscow or Beijing. I'm relying on the work of other, usually younger scholars who possess language skills that I don't have. But based upon the research of people like Ilya Gaiduk and Timothy Fursenko and other people who specialize in work in Soviet archives, Nikita Khrushchev, who at the time was the head of the Soviet Union, didn't care about Laos, to the point where he said to our roving ambassador, Averil Harriman, I don't know anything about Laos. It's irrelevant to me. I think the names of the leaders are silly. I can't remember them. Khrushchev was really concentrating on peaceful coexistence with the West, meaning specifically the United States. And he was worried that conditions in Laos might grow so unstable as to upset the apple cart and make his entire grand scheme for peaceful coexistence and lessening tension in the Cold War, that Laos was going to destroy that for him. So he did everything he could to rein in the communist Pathet Lao in Laos. He did everything he could to make sure that the leader of the Pathet Lao, Prince Supanavong, did not press his advantage too strongly. Khrushchev did everything he could to try to arrange a conference where there could be a triad government for Laos, communist, pro-Western, and neutralist. And he even said on a number of occasions, I'm just doing this for form's sake. It can be a country that leans toward the United States. It can be a country that's more anti-communist than pro-communist. I really don't care, just as long as I can remove this from my list of problems in the Cold War. So, and this is one thing that a lot of people forget. The Vienna Conference of 1961 between Kennedy and Khrushchev is part of Kennedy lore. We've all heard popular accounts about Khrushchev barking at him and Kennedy being off his game and Khrushchev threatening to cause World War III over Berlin, and Kennedy saying afterwards to his friend James Reston, the news reporter, he just beat the hell out of me. And it was a really high, white-knuckle, high-tension meeting. There was one point of agreement at that meeting. One, Khrushchev challenged the United States everywhere else except Laos. There he said, yes, whatever you want, fine. Neutralist government, you can even have your boy in charge as long as it technically is a neutralist government. I don't care. So the Soviet Union really didn't begin sending aid to Laos until the United States had thrown itself irretrievably behind a right-wing, pro-United States, anti-communist, anti-Soviet Union government that was unacceptable not only to Khrushchev but also to Mao Zedong. And speaking of Mao Zedong, he also went out of his way to diffuse the Lao crisis. He didn't give anywhere near as much aid to the Pathet Lao as we gave to the rightist forces in Laos. If you look at the timeline, Mao Zedong is dealing with the after effects of the disastrous after effects of the Great Leap Forward, famine in China. He does not want the United States to intervene again in a small country on China's border. The last time that happened was during the Korean War, and China lost about 1 million soldiers. Mao doesn't want to repeat that experience. He's very happy to act through his representative, Zhou Enlai, and arrive at some kind of modus vivendi that can even lean slightly westward. So neither the Soviet Union nor Communist China gave anywhere near as much aid to their ostensible proxies in Laos as the United States gave to its strongmen. And incidentally, when the Soviet Union finally did start funneling a lot of aid into Laos, its aid went to Suvarnabhumi, who was the neutralist leader in Laos, not to Supanavong, who was the head of the Pathet Lao, the communist group. So even when the Soviet Union started sending aid, it was not to the communists, it was to the neutralists. That shows, I think, how eager Khrushchev was for an amicable settlement. So the second part of your question was, if the Soviets and the Communist Chinese weren't really giving a lot of aid to the Pathet Lao under Supanavong or the neutralists under Kong Lei, then why weren't America's forces immediately victorious? And this is a question that policymakers just could not seem to wrap their minds around at the time, that Kong Lei and Supanavong were patriots. They wanted an independent Laos, free of foreign control. This is something that not only policymakers back then had a lot of trouble grasping, Americans nowadays have a lot of trouble grasping. that an Afghan patriot is every bit as patriotic as an American patriot. No nation wants its future dictated by a foreign power, whereas our strongmen in Laos, specifically Pumi Nasavan, but also Pui Nanakone and others, were self-evidently, to everyone in Laos, in the positions they occupied because they were backed by the United States. That they would never have risen to this position of prestige if Washington didn't want them to be there. And hence they weren't able to draw on the kind of indigenous support that, that someone like Supanavong or Kong Lei could draw upon. And there's another reason too. This is one that I've gotten into a lot of arguments with not so much historians, but political scientists, because I use an analogy that political scientists think is imperfect, and I'll acknowledge that it's imperfect, but I think it works anyway. I've said that Laos at mid-century was the Poland of Southeast Asia, in that it just lives in a really bad neighborhood. I mean, a really bad neighborhood where people don't like each other. On one flank, it's got this very pro-United States, pro-Western, anti-communist nation in Thailand. On the other flank, it's got this really, well, you've got North Vietnam and you've got communist China. And these are all nations that are much more populous than Laos, much more powerful than Laos. It's basically being crushed between these two opposing blocs. What does any sane statesman do under those circumstances? He tries to remain neutral. That's the only policy that's possible. That's what weak, vulnerable, fragile, young countries do. That's what we did, the United States, when we were first founded as a nation back in the 1770s and 1780s, when both superpowers, Great Britain and France, were trying so hard to get us to ally with them. And you may have noticed there's a real parallel here, because the Soviet Union and the United States would make these very indignant arguments to people like Jawaharlal Nehru in India or Subarnapuma in Laos. And why won't you side with us? We stand for everything you should care about. You owe us this incredible debt. It was the same thing in early American history, where the French would say to the administrations of George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, why won't you side with us? We helped you win your independence. You inspired our revolution. Lafayette helped you fight in your independence. You wouldn't have won your independence if Louis XVI hadn't underwritten it. How on earth can you possibly be neutral in the contest between us and Great Britain? And Britain, conversely, said, how can you possibly fail to side with us? You speak our language. You inherited our political institutions. We are your mother country. And Jefferson, Washington, Adams basically took the same position that the Lao took in the 1960s, which we don't have a choice, okay? We're young, we're weak, we're vulnerable. If we ally ourselves firmly with one side, we will incur the wrath of the other side, and we will probably be sentencing ourselves to death as a nation. We will probably be sentencing ourselves to occupation, and we can't do that because we're patriots. And that's basically what the Lao did. This was not an act of being pro-communist. It was not an act of cowardice or what was the term John Foster Dulles used to use about neutralism is an immoral strategy internationally. It wasn't immoral. It was necessary. It was dictated by international realities. And American policymakers just could not seem to grasp that rather elemental fact.
Why were these racist feelings, or as you put it in your book, the ensemble of assumptions that U.S. policymakers, the media, and by extension the public held about the character of the Laotian people so central to the political decisions made?
I think these racist assumptions, or the ensemble of assumptions, which incidentally is not my term. I borrowed that from Mark Bradley's marvelous book, Imagining Vietnam in America, where I went around and around and around trying to come up with the term that I wanted here. I think racism actually gets the job done pretty well, but I try to avoid that term because it sounds presentist, it sets eyes rolling. People say you're stacking the deck against a certain group of historical actors. So I thought ethnocentrism, but that sounds kind of clinical and it doesn't really sum up the kind of virulent hatred and contempt that American policymakers felt. Paternalism doesn't really get the job done either. There were a bunch of different terminology. Bias is just kind of nebulous and mushy. And so I finally just turned to Mark Bradley and said, there's an ensemble of assumptions here. And I really think, I'm prepared to defend this after having spent 5 years researching and writing this, that there is no group in the entire history of the United States that has been held in greater disdain than the Lao by American policymakers, for a variety of reasons, which we can go into. But this stereotype, or these stereotypes, these images, these assumptions, were so toxic and affected policymakers like our ambassador to Laos, J. Graham Parsons, like our Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, on such a visceral level that they really overrode more rational considerations, and they made any alternative course in Laos impossible. Even people who were by nature very pugnacious cold warriors, people like McGeorge Bundy, people like Dean Rusk, John F. Kennedy's Secretary of State, felt such contempt for the Lao, were so nauseated by this apparent lack of zeal for fighting, that they ultimately decided we don't have a choice. We have to accept a neutralist government. As much as it pains us, as much as it might result in South Vietnam having its flank turned, we have to accept a neutralist government because we simply can't rely upon these people. I think that's the reason why these assumptions are so important. And ultimately they proved to be decisive. Again, not saying that the United States thought the South Vietnamese were, by any stretch of the imagination, equal in character or intellect or anything to Westerners or Americans, but they did hold them in much higher regard than they held the Lao.
You quote more recent examples of these ensemble of assumptions, illustrating that they persist even to modern historical analysis. What makes these perceptions so obstinate?
What makes these perceptions so obstinate? Why don't they change? Why are they so enduring or immutable? That's a really good question, and actually I'm embarrassed to say I didn't really think about that question until it was raised in a review by this brilliant historian, Ann Foster at the University of Indiana. She was reviewing my book on HDiplo, which is the website for diplomatic historians, and she asked a question, that question. I mean, she said Jacobs cites this recent study by Roger Warner called Shooting at the Moon, which was published in the 1990s, and he says the same thing about the Lao that policymakers said way back in the 1950s. And Jacobs points out that Laos remained never land for these contemporary commentators, people writing in the 1990s or even nowadays. Why is that? Because, and she pointed this out, and she's right about this, that racial images tend to be very malleable. They tend to transmogrify over time to fit various circumstances. And the example she used, and it's a marvelous case in point, is American images of the Japanese. That yes, there has been a racist construction of the Japanese since at least World War II, actually earlier than that, but it's changed over time as circumstances dictated. So before World War II, before the Japanese humiliate us at Corregidor and elsewhere, you've got this image of these bespectacled, buck-toothed, bandy-legged, comical race, and then they score this spectacular victory, and the surrender in the Philippines is the biggest American surrender since Appomattox in the Civil War, and then all of a sudden the image flips completely into a blood-stained Superman, impervious to pain, careless of life, his own or anybody else's. Then we wind up winning the war, and all of a sudden it's still a simian image, but it's kind of a cute little monkey perched on the shoulder of an American GI, and all of a sudden they become star pupils, or if they're in the United States, the model minority. And then we have the trade wars of the 1980s, and all of a sudden they become these robber barons in pinstripe suits, and it's always a racist image. Each one of these images is equally racist, but it changes over time. Why didn't the image of the Lao change? And that's a really good question. And so I thought about it. And I finally decided, and I'm not sure whether this is a satisfactory response. In fact, I'm sure it won't satisfy Professor Foster. But I think it's because we have been powerfully involved with Japan for a long time. And our role with respect to Japan has changed from military adversary to occupying conqueror to Cold War ally to trade rival, and so on. And this has always been a major nation that policymakers and Americans, for obvious reasons, have been very concerned about. The situation with Laos is different. We were only really powerfully involved in Laos for a short period of time, the period that I cover in my book. Between 1954, the Geneva Conference, that basically settled the Franco-Vietnamese War, and the 1961-62 Geneva Conference that ended the Laos crisis. Didn't really end it, resolved it as far as the Americans were concerned. That's about 8 years. After that, Laos fades from the headlines in the United States. It fades from the national discussion. We concentrate on Vietnam. Of course, policymakers are still active in Laos because we're bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail there, and we're arming the Hmong in this CIA's clandestine army, but it's not really the main stage. And then when the communists, the Pathet Lao, win in 1975, when they destroy the 600-year-old monarchy, then really, as was the case in a lot of these countries in Southeast Asia, you sort of have this iron curtain drawn on events in Laos, and you just don't know what's happening there. So we don't have any real contact, anything intimate, anything profound with Laos for a very long time, I would argue even today. And I think that enabled these mid-century derogative images to kind of remain frozen. As was the case, I would argue, with American images of China, say between 1949 and 1972, when Nixon went to China. We really didn't know what was going on inside that country. We had guesswork, but we didn't really, you didn't have the kind of diplomatic interaction, cultural interaction, so you had a frozen image that didn't evolve the way the image of the Japanese did. And that is why, when Father Matt Menger was in Laos writing one of his very popular books about his service in Laos in the late 1950s. And when Roger Warner, who, by the way, is a very fine historian, and I hated to have to cite these passages in Shooting at the Moon, but sorry, he did say this. When he's writing that book in the 1990s, both he and Menger, when they reach for the first adjective they can think of to describe the Lao, grab the same word, the same derisive, incredibly insulting, grotesquely insensitive word. They both refer to the Lao as retarded. That's the term that they chose. And they're separated by almost half a century, but it's exactly the same descriptor. And I think that's because our interaction with Laos was cut short and remained disconnected for a very long time.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about your book?
I don't know whether this is relevant or not, but I feel an obligation to say this. Every author, certainly every academic author, has a list of acknowledgments at the beginning of his book or her book, in which he or she lists people who played a role, without whose help the book would not have been possible. And actually, Walter Isaacson, the journalist, had a marvelous, he dedicated his book, his biography of Henry Kissinger, to his daughter Rachel. And he said that she was born while I was working on this book, and when she was able to walk, when she was 2 years old, she was always toddling into the office, and she proved endlessly distracting. And I would like to thank my daughter Rachel, without whose invaluable help this book would have been finished in half the time. And so, but in this case, I really did have someone with whom this book simply would not have been possible. As in, I would not have been able to write it because there was no way I'd be able to do the kind of research that I did, and that was Joel Halpern. Who is currently a professor of anthropology emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He was kind of my eyes on the ground in Laos. He was there with the United States Operations Mission in 1957, leading a community development project in Luang Prabang. He took thousands of pages of field notes. He sent hundreds of letters home. And he let me look at all of this. Which was an incredible gift. And then he went back to Laos in 1959 and he did basically the same thing. So without those documents that he composed, and also he was a real pack rat. He saved everything in the U.S. mission, everything at the embassy, everything he found in Vientiane, which was Laos's administrative capital. The book simply wouldn't have been possible. So he and I had some run-ins while I was writing the book, and he is not pleased with some of the things that I wrote. And I did not measure up to his scholarly standards, which are extremely exacting. But without his, it was invaluable help. The book would not have been written. It just wouldn't have been possible. So I have to give a shout out to him, whether he'd appreciate it or not.